This evening I'm going to talk about the art of solitude. And as a preamble to that, I need to put this into context. One of the books of mine that Stefan failed to mention is called After Buddhism. It's recently came out last year or this year. In German it's Jenseits der Buddhismus, des Buddhismus. Jenseits des Buddhismus. And this is quite a thick book, and in many ways it is the culmination of my life's work as a Buddhist practitioner and scholar and teacher. And I'm not going to talk about that, but that is a work that in many ways brought my project of seeking to articulate, to present a secular reading of the Dharma to a kind of conclusion. I can't really go much further than that. After Buddhism, in a sense, closes the circle of my work that began with another book that Stefan didn't mention called Alone with Others, which was published in 1983, a long time ago. Still in print, believe it or not. It was also translated into German, but I don't think it's available anymore. It was translated as Mit anderen allein. And you might already have picked up, this is not disconnected to the art of solitude. In a strange way, I'm coming back full circle from the completion of one project to where I began then. The Alone with Others was written as an attempt to make sense of my experience as a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner. I spent 7 years as a monk, mainly studying Buddhist philosophy, epistemology, logic, debating that rather more scholarly aspect of Tibetan Buddhism. And when I came back here to Switzerland, I started getting very much interested in Western philosophy and theology. And I started reading Heidegger. I read a number of Christian theologians, particularly Paul Tillich. And that process of engaging with Western, largely existentialist philosophy and theology, together with my Tibetan Buddhist training as a Gelugpa monk, resulted in a book called Alone with Others, where I tried to use the language of existentialism to state in a fresher, more accessible language my understanding of the Dharma. And that's really where my whole writing career, if that's not quite the right word, my writing vocation, it's mehr ein Beruf in that sense. Rufung, that's right. Not a Beruf. Rufung, a calling. That's where that all began. And since then, I've been writing continuously. Writing is for me something I do. It is not just a sort of process of recording things and then just putting it into a book form and then letting it go. Writing is for me a practice. It's as central a practice, if not, it's in a sense more central than meditation itself. The act of writing. We can maybe talk about that later. So, in around 2013, when I turned 60, I'd got to a point in my engagement with Buddhist practice, my work as a writer, and also my work as an artist, which Stefan mentioned, that I kind of needed to step back and rethink, revisit what this whole 40-year endeavour has been about, to kind of take stock of my life, as it were. And 2013 was a year I took out as a sabbatical. I didn't teach, or I taught very little. I travelled a lot. I made pilgrimages to India, to Korea. I walked on the Camino in Spain. I did a lot of things that I'd put off doing for a long time. It was a year really of collecting my thoughts, reflecting on what I had done, and also, of course, opening myself to where to go from that point on. And this is where the project, which I call The Art of Solitude, began. One of the places where it really started for me when I visited an ancient Buddhist cave temple, as they're sometimes called, a rock-cut temple. You understand what they are? The most famous ones are Ajanta, Ellora, in India, and these are the earliest Buddhist monasteries or temples that exist. And they have survived in India because they were cut into the rock. They weren't freestanding buildings which you will fall down or you can destroy. They were cut by high tensile steel chisels into very hard rock cliff faces. And they have survived intact, many of them, right up till today. They're about 2,000 years old. They were built around the time of Christ. And they have this extraordinary quality of being aniconic. In other words, there are no Buddha images. This is before the Buddha image was thought of. You only have a stupa at the end of a long gallery, which has an apse at the end like a church. In the core of the apse is a stupa. Now, I spent a day in one of these places called Bedsa. Bedsa is one of the smaller of these rock-cut temples. It's not very well known. In fact, when we went there with our group, we were the only people there all day. There wasn't even the guy to take your ticket. It was completely deserted. Absolutely wonderful. And it's there that some of this project began to take shape in my mind. This was triggered by a Buddhist text that I had started to study at the same time. A text called the Attack of Agra in Pali, which means the chapter of eights. And the chapter of eights is considered by scholars to be the earliest layer of the Pali canon. It's written in a very early form of Pali. They're written in verse, these chapters of 8, and they're very pithy, they're very direct, and they are quite different in tone and style to much of what we are used to reading in the Pali canon, in the middle-length discourses and so on. And I was intrigued by not only the content of these texts, but also their structure and their form. The Attack of Agra has 16 chapters, but 4 of them, only 4 of them, actually have 8 verses. That's chapter 2, 3, 4 and 5. And each of those chapters has 8 verses, making a total of 32. And they address, or they begin with the idea of solitude. So the first verse talks about a person living in their cell or their cave, a man sunk in dark passions is a long, long way from solitude, from Viveka. Einsam sein, not Einsamkeit. It's about Einsam sein, being alone. And that verse, together with the structure of these 4 poems, 8, 8, 8, 8, somehow came together in my mind at Bedsa, this rock-cut temple, which would have been built, again, not long after these poems were composed. And somehow the temple struck me as these early Buddhist teachings cut from stone. Does that make any sense at all? And in other words, these temples for me are powerful because they evoke by their sheer geometry. Remember, there's no Buddha images, no bodhisattvas, no devas, nothing. It's just a geometric space. The stupa at the end of the hall is simply a cube, a sphere. No, wait a minute. No, it's not. It's a cylinder mounted by a sphere, mounted by a cube. Simple Euclidean shapes. And the whole of the temple itself is built in such a way that great attention is paid to the proportions of the space. You're not distracted by any images. You're just in a geometric space. There's, to me, an extraordinary purity in this architecture. And if you haven't visited these places, I would highly recommend it. Somehow this connected together with the 4 eights, as I call them, these 2nd, 3rd, 4th and 5th chapters, all of 8 verses. And I know this sounds a bit mystical, wistical, but it appeared to me in a vision, as it were. I suddenly saw these 4 eights as a grid, 4 across, 8 down. And somehow they struck me as, again, a very fundamental, simple geometric, or not geometric here, but a spatial kind of grid. And that is the form I use in my artwork. Since about 1995, I've also been making collage. And I make my collages out of found materials only. I pick up rubbish in the street, I go through people's waste paper baskets, I do all kinds of things to just collect materials, paper, plastic, cloth, anything that can be glued onto a card surface. I then cut these different pieces of flattened pieces of paper, cloth and plastic, and then I organize them together onto a grid-like background. So I cut them into rectangles or squares of equal size, and they then become the raw elements of these collages that I make. Again, very difficult to describe. You really have to see them to get what I'm trying to do here. Now, why do I do that? Isn't that a rather bizarre activity? I do it as a non-conceptual counterpart to my writing. All of my books, at least those since about the mid-90s, which would begin with Buddhism Without Beliefs, were all accompanied by a parallel process of making works of collage. And I don't mention this in any of the books, but for me as a writer, it is an integral part of my work. When I'm writing, using words and concepts, I'm also making collages that are non-verbal, non-conceptual. The similarity is that both processes are compositions. In one, I'm composing words and sentences and paragraphs and chapters, and on another, I'm using shapes and colours and bits of found text or whatever it is that's lying around. But the whole point of both processes is that you are organising materials, you're putting materials together that then produce a work that cannot be reduced to the raw materials. They become something more than the sum of their parts. They become a gestalt, as it were. So in 2013, I had the idea that I would like to move on in my creative life by integrating my written work with my collage work. The idea came to me that I would write a book as though it were a collage, that I would use the same principles to organise the text as I would use to organise the pieces of coloured paper and so on. It struck me that it would be, instead of keeping them as two separate processes, to try to integrate them into one. So, The Art of Solitude, the book, and there's also The Art of Solitude, the collage. They're one thing now. And because of the Attack of Agra texts, and my image of them as a grid, 4 along, 8 down, 32 pieces, that became the template for the book. 32 chapters. There are 32 chapters in the book, and they're organised along 4 themes. So there are 4 themes, 32 chapters. Each theme has 8 chapters. So they mirror the structure of the Attack of Agra texts. But that purely formally. I say very, very little in the book about the Attack of Agra. Once or twice I introduce a verse, but it's not a commentary on the text in any conventional way. It's a commentary purely driven by an aesthetic intuition, if that makes any sense. And I therefore then was looking for material that I could write about that would somehow address the opening concept in the 4/8, which is that of solitude. And perhaps it's there that perhaps it's because of that when I was at Bedsa, this cave temple I described, which is on top of a mountain, it's halfway up a mountain, it was a hermitage, it was a retreat centre. It only had it had room for about 20 monks. You have the room with the stupa in it, and then you have another section a few metres away where you have about 9 cells cut into the rock, each with 2 beds. So you get 2 monks in each cell. It's a retreat centre for about 20 people. And it's here that the project began to coalesce. Solitude, the images, the number of chapters, and then I made it even more precise that each of the 4 sections with 8 chapters would be of exactly 8,000 words. Right? This is the kind of thinking that goes behind the collages. The collages are a mixture of something which is very informal, in other words, rubbish I find lying around on the street, totally random, just where I happen to go. I never buy materials. I only use found stuff. So there's a randomness. And it's a randomness about things that are discarded and rejected and thrown away and considered to have no value or use. By collecting them and reforming them into collages, I transform the useless into the beautiful, or at least something that aspires to beauty. So I decided to give the same strict rules to the writing. The 4 themes would be in 8 chapters, a total of 8,000 words per chapter, and therefore overall a total of 32,000 words in the book. And by 8,000 words, I mean 8,000 words, not 7,999 and not 8,001, but bang on 8,000. And I stuck to that. And I found it an extraordinarily useful constraint to focus my writing. So what were the themes that then what themes that were inspired by the idea of solitude would I then address in these 4 essays? The first was the idea of solitude itself, both in terms of physical solitude. In other words, I include visits to solitary places. The book has an element of being a travelogue, but I also include my reflections on art, which is to do more with the process of creativity. The process of making a book like a collage is actually acknowledging this is an artwork as much as a book. It's an art project. And so I explore in this first essay also artists who, for me, address the issue of being alone. And the 2 artists I chose were Johannes Vermeer and Agnes Martin. I'm sure you're familiar with Vermeer's paintings, which are of course very famous. What is particular in his work that draws me is his capacity to somehow be able to depict in his figures, particularly those of women, in single women in domestic situations. The most famous one is the Milkmaid. You see it everywhere on all sorts of commercial products, but also others like the Woman in Blue reading a letter, and about 10 other works I focused on. And to me, Vermeer is the consummate artist of solitude. He captures, as it were, human beings from the inside, as it were. He captures them alone in their domestic settings. He mysteriously is able to somehow show us them in the act of reflecting and thinking and feeling their own interiority. To me, this is very potent in Vermeer, and I don't think anyone does it remotely as well. I think Vermeer is in a class of his own. So during the period it took me to write the book, I went and saw 21 of the surviving 35 paintings of Vermeer. So the project involved going to art galleries in Vienna, in Berlin, in Dublin, in New York, to be in the presence of these extraordinary works of art. The other artist that I write about is Agnes Martin, who is a 20th century American abstract painter who spent most of her life in New Mexico. And again, I don't have time now to go into the whole story of Agnes Martin, but her work is her mature work, the work that she regarded as accomplished, as fulfilled, were all effectively 2 meter by 2 meter, no, not quite that big, about this big, squares on basically bands of lines in pencil and ink or colour wash of exactly the same size. That's all she did for the last 40 years of her life, just endlessly produced these images. And she did so by living a life of profound solitude. She actually writes about solitude. This is not just my reading of it. This is her primary value and passion, is to live a life of total solitude to such a point that her mind becomes completely empty. And in that empty mind, she also meditated, but in that empty mind she would then receive what she called inspiration. And that inspiration for her would appear as a tiny little square in her mind with exactly this patterning on it that she would then transfer onto a canvas. So her practice was the practice of art drawn from her experience of solitude. So Vermeer, Agnes Martin, the visiting of solitary places, that's what constitutes the first part of the book. But it's not the first part of the book, as I'll explain later, because it all gets all mixed up by random choice, chance-selected processes later. But I'll talk about that in a minute. The second essay, the second 8,000-word essay in 8 parts, is a reflection on the practice of meditation itself. So this is, in some respects, a very personal account of my own meditative life. And I talk about experiences as a child. I talk about the different retreats I've done, Vipassana retreats, Zen retreats. Also, while I was writing the book, I did jhana practice as well. I did 2 jhana retreats with a man called Lee Brasington. And this essay, therefore, is an exploration of the practice of solitude through different meditative practices and disciplines. That's relatively straightforward, and that's also the most Buddhist part of the book, because all of my practices have taken place within a Buddhist frame. The third essay is it focuses entirely on the philosophy of Michel de Montaigne. As you are no doubt aware, Montaigne was a politician, a diplomat, an essayist who lived in 16th century France, not very far from where Martine and I currently live, up the Dordogne Valley. And he was an extraordinary man. He was a high Renaissance figure. His father wanted him to become a true Renaissance man. And to do this, he did not allow his son to speak anything but Latin until the age of 7. So Latin was Montaigne's mother tongue. Even the servants had to learn Latin. And he only started speaking French when he went to school in Bordeaux about the age of 8. But Montaigne was, because of his upbringing, was exposed to the newly discovered texts of ancient Greek and Roman philosophy that were coming to light in exactly that period. The Renaissance, of course, is the rebirth, the rediscovery of classical literature and philosophy in that period in Europe. And Montaigne was right at the heart of all of that. He served as a lawyer in the Parliament in Bordeaux for a number of years, but at the age of 37, he retired, which sounds a bit early for us, but he decided at that point that he wanted to retreat to the solitude of his estate, and he decided to effectively move in to a tower on the edge of the chateau where he was living, and this tower had 3 stories. He converted the bottom story into a chapel, the middle story into his living area, and the upper story into his library, where he had possibly as many as 1,000 books of almost entirely classical philosophy, literature, in Latin and in Greek. And he devoted his life from then on to the practice of solitude. And solitude, in one of his essays, is of course called On Solitude. It's one of the most famous accounts of what in fact it means to be alone. Montaigne took solitude as his key practice. Not that he found it easy. When he first began this practice, he fell into a very deep depression. He says in one of his texts that he had this fantasy, this idea, that he would just sit in his library, surrounded by his books, and let his mind just rest in peace and idleness and turn his thoughts towards philosophy. But he said what actually happened was that he found that his mind was like a runaway horse that galloped hither and thither with no order or plan. And anyone who's done a meditation retreat knows what he's talking about. So in order to somehow gain some control over his mind, he began to make a very close analysis and observation of his own feelings, his own thoughts. He did, for the first time in Western literature, began to talk about his innermost life without any kind of religious agenda, without trying to prove anything, but just in an attempt to be utterly transparent and honest with his readers. And this is what the essays of Montaigne, which are now so famous, are so known for. It's the first time that someone had done that. He invented this form of writing, which we're now very used to. People are, all forms of literature are now often very introspective. They're talking about the inner life, the stream of consciousness, and all of these things. But all of that began with Montaigne. So the next part of this Art of Solitude project was to get as best as possible understanding of Montaigne, both in his life and particularly in his philosophy. His philosophy it shifted in different periods in his life, but it seems to me that the philosophy he regarded as the most useful was that of the Greek skeptics, particularly Pyrrho and his philosophy of radical skepticism. He was also, like most Renaissance men and also people since then, profoundly influenced by Socrates. Socrates was, for Montaigne, the wisest man that ever lived. And he was drawn to these philosophies not out of some analytical or intellectual interest. He was drawn to these philosophies because they provided him with a framework for living. For him, philosophy was a way of life. It was about a practice that you applied rigorously throughout the day and thereby somehow reached what might be called wisdom or understanding. Now, some of these texts are remarkably reminiscent of Buddhist meditation, particularly mindfulness-type practices. He talks about how he needs to observe the beginnings of his thoughts and his emotions when they first start stirring within him. And he says if you can catch these first whispers and breezes of emotion, then you can catch them and prevent them from building up into a storm. So in other words, he was learning to meditate. He was, without knowing that word at all, without knowing anything whatsoever about what we would understand as Buddhist meditation, Buddhism was completely unknown. He drew from the works of Pyrrho, of the Socratic dialogues, and of also others, of Seneca, Cicero, Lucretius, and many others, to arrive at a practical philosophy which for him was profoundly a way of life. So the third 8 sections in 8,000 words is about Montaigne, and a lot of it is actually my own translations of Montaigne's French. This was actually quite a lot of work. I had to read all of the essays, which is 3 volumes. It's a lot of stuff, and a lot of it's not very interesting. But there are so many gems within it that by the end of the day, I had ample material for my Art of Solitude project, way more than 8,000 words. I had to boil it down and boil it down and boil it down. But at the end of the day, we have this essay, this reflection on the philosophy of Montaigne, particularly in terms of his philosophical practice of solitude. The 4th section of the book concerns my own revisiting of plant medicines. At the age of 16, in 2013, another thing I wanted to very much to do was to revisit what had brought me into Buddhism in the first place, and one of those things was the taking of drugs like LSD, which as a young person, like many of my friends of that period, was an integral part of our growing up in the end of the 1960s, beginning of the 1970s. And my taking of LSD under completely inappropriate settings, taking stuff that could well have been poison, nonetheless brought me to certain experiences that showed me that there was more than just one way of being conscious. That psychedelics opened up the world in a totally new light that was both awe-inspiring and at the same time also frightening at times. It wasn't comfortable always. I had a bad trip at least once. But nonetheless, it was this awakening of that new mode of consciousness that led me to become interested in Eastern forms of religion, particularly Buddhism, Taoism to some degree, Hinduism to some degree. And that is what really set me off to India at the age of 19, as Stefan mentioned. But in other words, the experience with LSD was much more interesting than what I was learning at school. And to such an extent that I failed my high school graduation. I was unable to get the place at a college in London that I'd applied for because I didn't have the qualifications. And this was, of course, what made my whole career in Buddhism possible. Because I couldn't do that, so I went on what they nowadays call a gap year. But I haven't come back from my gap year. I'm still on my gap year. It's about 40 years now. And I've never been to university. I've never had a higher Western education. Instead, I trained in Buddhist monasteries in India, and then in Switzerland, and then in Korea. And all of that, in a way, was triggered by the experience of LSD. I hadn't taken LSD since then, and I very much wanted, as part of this taking stock of my life at the age of 60, to go back to some of those experiences, but not by just taking a pill in my living room and listening to Bach or the Rolling Stones, or whatever it was. I very much wanted to take these substances in a ceremonial and religious settings, because I realized how important the setting was for these experiences, and particularly a spiritual, and a consciously spiritual or religious setting struck me as very important. And I also wanted to take not synthesized chemicals, but natural plants. So in that same year, 2013, the same year I was in Bedsa and conceiving of this project, studying the Attack of Agra, I arranged with a friend of mine in Mexico to set up a ceremony with a maricame, a shaman of the Huichol tribe in Mexico, which utilizes the peyote cactus. And so I went to Mexico, and I spent a night in the company of the maricame and a few of his apprentices and my friend Nacho, and we ate cactus. Basically, they grate it up, and then you drink the sort of liquefied flesh of the cactus itself. And when we would spend the whole night just seated around a fire in the middle of a forest under a rather basic sort of canopy, and that was a profoundly meaningful experience. And if I were to summarize it, it boiled down to two things. First, a deep sense of confirmation, and secondly, a sense of cleansing or purification. The peyote did not produce any hallucinations or any kind of visual psychedelic-y patterns. The mind was incredibly still, incredibly limpid and clear, and the whole night was spent effectively in a deep state of contemplation. A very, very powerful frame of mind. It was in silence, and the impact of this ceremony continued for many weeks after the actual event itself, and it gave me a deep bodily sense of affirmation, confirmation in the life that I had led over the past 40 years. It was tremendously confirming. Again, it doesn't sound terribly special, but again, it had to do with a far more a physiological, a physical sense of having somehow internalized these values. But at the same time, it gave an enormous feeling of somehow having been washed clean in the inside. Difficult to say much more than that. Subsequently, over the next few years, the next 5 years, while I was writing this book, I participated in 2 ayahuasca ceremonies with shamans, one from Spain, one from Germany, and both of those ceremonies were conducted here in Europe, one here in Switzerland, another in Spain, with small groups, some people I knew, most of whom I didn't, and again it was about spending the night, having, in this case you drink the ayahuasca, which is, as some of you probably know, it's a concoction of a vine and a leaf that are found in the Amazonian forests, and they are cooked up, and you then drink this rather vile tasting black liquid that has as its active ingredient dimethyltryptamine, DMT, which is a powerful psychedelic drug. Now, the difference with the ayahuasca was that that it involved, for me, a lot of purging. In Spanish, it's called la purga. You throw up a lot, basically, and the vomiting, for me, was very, very intense. That, once again, like with the peyote, had this double impact, both a sense of confirmation and a sense of purification or cleansing. With the ayahuasca and the purging, the cleansing is, in a sense, much more visible, much more obvious, much more graphic, and also kind of uncomfortable too. It's not nice to be throwing up all night. But once again, at the end of both of these ceremonies, I felt again this deep feeling of confirmation and purification. The difference with the ayahuasca, though, is that after I came back home from this ceremony, I realized that my body no longer was interested in alcohol. I live in Bordeaux. I'm used to drinking wine on every day, nice half bottle of wine. When I got back from this ceremony, my body just knew that wine, beer, scotch, whatever, wasn't interested anymore. And since then, and that was now a year and a half ago, I've not touched a drop. And I have no interest in drinking alcohol. So the cleansing was not just about sort of a spiritual thing at all. It actually rid me of a certain kind of addictive behavior. I don't think I was an alcoholic, but I was drinking alcohol on a daily basis. And I don't do that anymore. The second ceremony, which took place in Spain fairly recently, actually, this was just last December, was even more powerful in terms of the cleansing, the purging. But what I felt was vomited out in this experience was another addiction, my addiction to Buddhism. And I'm serious here, I'm not joking. That's not to say I've never had a drop of Buddhism since. But my whole relationship to Buddhism has changed. I no longer feel that I need to justify myself by quoting a passage from the Pali Canon. I feel somehow that I've freed myself from what I think might have been a somewhat unhealthy identification with that particular religious tradition. On the other hand, I found that especially the experience in Malaga in Spain brought me deeply into touch with what I can only call nirvana. Nirvana meaning the absence of the reactive patterns of greed and hatred and delusion. And for much of the 2 nights during this ceremony, I effectively just dwelt in a deep contemplative embrace of a non-reactive mind. And that, I feel, is at the core of the Dharma. It may not be the core of Buddhism, the religion, but it's frankly what the Dharma is about. And I think it is what the Buddha meant by solitude. If we go back to the first verse of the Attack of Agra, about this man sunk in dark passions is a long, long way from solitude. In other words, just to go into a cave and meditate and get absorbed in your stuff and kind of stew in your own neurotic juices is a long, long way from solitude. You might be alone, you might be totally introspective, but you're not experiencing a genuine viveka, solitude. Solitude, I've come to understand, is another way of talking about emptiness, nirvana, freedom, that lies at the very heart of the practice of the Dharma. So this whole process is described and reflected upon in the 8 chapters of the 4th part of the book. And what becomes clear is that these 4 very different ways of reflecting upon solitude somehow begin to meet. Vermeer, Montaigne, doing jhana practice, taking peyote, all of these things crystallize around the felt experience of solitude. And at the end of the second ayahuasca experience, I had a very strong feeling that that the ayahuasca, the peyote, had done their work. I actually have no interest, at the moment at least, of taking these things again. In that sense, for me, they are medicines. I deliberately, through the book, never use the word drugs. Always medicine. This is a form of medication. This is a form of healing. And I think we need very much in our time to find a language to talk about these kinds of experiences that is freed from the negative associations of the word drugs. I'd like to think of all of this in terms of medication. Remember, the Buddha too spoke of the Dharma as medicine. He spoke of himself as a physician, a doctor. Now, when we hear that today, we probably think of a man in a white coat with a stethoscope. But of course, at the Buddha's time, the doctors would have been the shamans. And my sense is that the early Buddhist community was still very much part of an animistic, shamanistic culture. And I wonder if some of the practices, particularly jhana practice, I think jhana practice overlaps very easily with the experiences of plant medicines. I think we're getting into very similar territory. They're both about ecstasy and bliss. They're both about stillness and clarity. And if you look at some of the metaphors the Buddha uses for the jhanas, it's very rich with natural imagery of water and plants and so forth and so on. So that basically is the book. But one more thing. In my collages, I work on, I said I use this idea of randomly finding bits of paper and rubbish, putting them together in a very ordered and preconceived structure. But the way that I organize where the different pieces of the collage go are by what are called chance operations. If you're familiar with John Cage, the composer, he would compose music by using the I Ching. You'd toss coins, and depending which coins fall, so that's D flat. And In other words, he took his ego out of the process of composition. And that's what I try to do with my collages. I try to take Stephen Batchelor and his wishes and what he thinks works best, get rid of that. I just want these collages to be ordered, but ordered by random chance operations. So when I wrote all 32 chapters in the 4 essays, a total of 32 chapters, I then devised a system of chance operations which would determine where each of these chapters went in the book. I didn't decide that. That was decided largely by chance operations. I won't go into the details of the operation itself. So in other words, when I read this book now, I don't know what the next chapter is going to be about, and let alone anybody else. It's you're reading about Montaigne, and the next thing you know, he's lying on the floor vomiting in Spain, and the next thing you know, he's on a retreat somewhere, and the next thing you know, he's talking about a painting of Vermeer. It's all very sort of, randomly connected, and yet there is a continuity because each of the 4 essays has its own continuity. And I've preserved the order of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, but I've mixed them all up randomly. So this book, believe it or not, is going to be published. And in fact, but I deliberately wrote it without a contract. I didn't want to have an editor or a publishing deadline to influence the work itself. So I wrote the whole thing, finished it, and then I gave it to my agent in New York. And quite quickly she had 2 publishers eager to publish it. And we chose in the end to go with a company called Spiegel and Grau, which is a Random House division in New York, and it will come out in February 2020. Year and a bit. This is the price you pay for not getting a contract, because you're at the end of the queue, basically. So if you're interested, then in February 18th, 2020, this book will be available. So I hope this has been of some interest to you. I know it's been rather self-indulgent, all of these things I've been talking about, but it's been a very important part of my own practice, my own work as a writer, my own work as a practitioner, and my own struggle to make sense of the Dharma. Any questions? Comments?